Want to take us live?
Yep. So I just hit the button. It's working on it now, and I'm going to hit record. So
perfect. All right. Welcome, everybody. We're super excited to kick this off. I'm going to turn it over to Ted White from Athletics.
Thanks, Christine. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ted White, and I'm Deputy Athletic Director.
Welcome, everybody.
My name is Ted White, and I'm the Deputy Athletic Director for Student Athlete Development and Sport Performance. One of my roles in athletics is overseeing our Ethical Leadership Academy, so I'd like to welcome members of our group back for their second year of programming. I'd also like to thank Jess Wilk and our team in athletics, Christine Mahoney and her team from Social Entrepreneurship, Christian Namak. Our tour guide for this incredible journey, Chris Phelan, our special guest this evening, and of course, members of Profit with Purpose, for your willingness to join us in this important and groundbreaking partnership. From the time we first sought to create a program to help student athletes develop values-based leadership skills and an ethical decision-making framework, we knew that to do it right, we'd need to connect them with faculty, alumni, administrators, and other student leaders and get out of the way. Tonight represents a huge step for us in that direction, and we cannot think of a better, more comprehensive way for you all to make an impact as future leaders than to study impact investing and social entrepreneurship. So let me thank all of you again, tell you how excited that we are to be part of this experience and get out of the way.
Thank you so much, Ted. And for the Leadership Academy student athletes, I had the opportunity to meet you all last year in the first year of the Leadership Academy. And what we heard from so many of you is that you are interested in making the world a better place when it comes to supporting children, access to education, improving racial equity, improving economic equity. And all of these things can be advanced through government, and they can be advanced through charitable organizations. But we know that the real power is in the private sector and the capital markets, where there's potentially trillions of dollars and powerful organizations that can help us make the world a better place. And so this year, we're going to have 8 awesome sessions looking at how do we use the trillions of dollars in the investment world to advance things like gender equity, racial equity, more resilient communities when it comes to climate change. And so luckily we have some UVA alumni that are experts in this world. And so I want to introduce you all to Christian, who is the co-founder of Hansa Impact Partners and founder of Nordic Reach. He's worked with institutional investors internationally since 1986, since he left UVA. And he's worked as a consultant for the past 15 years in sectors including finance, the arts, public land stewardship. And his focus these days is on field building and promoting impact investing. So we are super happy to have Christian with us, teaching us the ins and outs of mobilizing capital for the common good. So Christian, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And I have to say, I couldn't be happier than to be doing this tonight. I'm so, you know, as a UVA graduate, it's so much fun to talk to UVA students. And I will pivot between a presentation and speaking to you live. So I'm going to turn to my presentation first. Hang on a sec. And I'm not technically that proficient, so we'll see if it works. Screen share. Great. So I'm going to start today with sort of a basic primer and talk about the basic concepts of impact investing. And then we'll focus on the UN SDGs. The UN SDGs to me are kind of the best framework to think about impact investing. And I actually found a specialist who's going to talk about that specifically, who's Chris Phelan. Let me advance a page. Here we go. So the agenda, I'm going to give you a brief overview of impact investing and a bit of history. It really started, I'll go into more detail, but impact investing really started with faith-based investing. It started with different religious groups who had a belief that their religious faith caused them to use their money in a specific way, and I'll talk about that. And in the more recent history, we had socially responsible investing that really came out of social movements in the 60s and 70s. And then much more recently in the early 2000s, the term ESG was coined, and that was actually coined by Kofi Annan at the UN. And I'll talk a bit about that. And you'll hear that phrase a lot, ESG. It stands for environmental, social, and governance issues. And then most recently, just really in the last 10 years, impact investing has become one of the key topics. And that's what I really focus on in my own personal business life, is impact investing. And they're each slightly different. And so I'll go into that in a minute. And again, we'll go into a deep dive with the UN SDGs with Chris. And just to give you a sense of this fall, today we'll focus on just the big background and the big picture. Next month we'll focus on, the fall will focus on social factors, and in the spring we'll focus on environmental factors. Today is kind of an overview, and then we'll talk about the SDGs as a framework. And in October, we'll talk about economic mobility as a topic for investing and investments that create economic mobility. In November, we'll talk about racial justice and how can investments help racial justice, promote racial justice, be anti-racist, in other words. And then finally in December, we'll talk about gender equity. How can our investments promote equity between men and women and non-binary people? What does that look like? And yeah, we'll focus on environmental factors in the spring. And I think if I can do this, I'll stop the share. Does anybody have any questions yet? Because I want to make this an iterative process. I don't want to lecture at you the whole time, but that's pretty much the agenda.
We might just say what the SDGs are too, because those
yeah.
acronyms.
Sorry. The SDGs, it stands for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's interesting to talk about it today because tomorrow is the 75th convening of the UN here in New York. And the SDGs were created by the UN, and they were created 5 years ago, or they were affirmed 5 years ago tomorrow. I mean, they've been worked on for a while. Chris will go into that. But there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and each one, like no poverty is one of them. Honoring life on the land is one of them. Life underwater is one of them. And they're a really good framework for targeting investments. So often when I talk to a hedge fund manager or a bond manager, I'll say, who's an impact manager, I'll say, you know, which of the 17 SDGs is your fund focused on? You know, what, you know, and it forces people to be kind of specific about what their social or environmental goals are. And it's a framework that's been adopted pretty universally and pretty much globally. And because it's the UN has the ability to kind of market something on a global scale and be taken seriously. And so what's been difficult for this whole space, whether it's impact investing or ESG investing, is we're still figuring out what that means. And people will also say, oh yeah, I have an ESG fund. And without being more specific, it's hard to know what they mean. And it's hard to know, are they focusing broadly? Are they focusing on one topic? And so the SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals, give us as investors or as fund managers a really good framework to work with, kind of a common language. And typically a fund will focus on 1 or 2 or 3 SDGs. It's rare that they'll, you know, unless it's an index fund investing in the whole stock market. And then they might say, okay, this, but typically they'll focus in on a few of them at once. That's what I've found. So let me go back to the presentation. Are you seeing a screen share now, or do you see? Hang on a sec, screen share. I'm not great at this. Okay. So a few basic terms just to cover before we get into the details are the term asset class. I don't know how proficient you are in investing, but when we talk about asset classes, we're talking about the different categories of investments broadly, like the different buckets that people.
Christian, I think you might need to change your screen share. We're seeing your email.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, let me see. Hang on a sec. Okay. Hang on one sec. Do you see the PowerPoint now? Great. So basically, yeah, the first thing I want to talk about it's just a basic finance concept or asset classes. And when people invest, the first thing they think about or what asset classes will they invest in? And, and ESG and impact investing can be effective in every asset class, whether it's cash, stocks, bonds, private equity, venture capital, or real assets. And by real assets, that's usually property and infrastructure investing. And I think, when we talk about racial justice investing, we're going to talk about banking and lending, and that's sort of a cash and bond category. In October, when we talk about financial inclusion, we'll be talking to a private equity and venture capital manager. I'll try to get an infrastructure manager in the spring to talk about, wind farms and solar arrays. But just remember that impact investing can be applied to all the different asset classes.
And we might even just mention for venture capital for the non-McIntyre grads out there, that is when you're investing in a startup company. So you guys have all seen Shark Tank. It's when you invest early in a company that's just getting built. And private equity is when you're investing in a much bigger company that is in the growth stage. So, maybe they're making millions of dollars every year and have hundreds and hundreds of employees.
Yeah, like the sort of life cycle of a company is that it's you have an idea, you try to find seed investors or angel investors, that's phase one. And then you find venture capitalists when you're ready to grow it up a little bit. And then you enter the private equity world. And then finally, if you want to, you try to bring it public as a public company. And again, people are active in impact all through that life cycle of a corporation. The other set of terms, the second bullet point, and this is an important one because these three terms get used interchangeably: SRI, ESG, and impact. So SRI stands for socially responsible investing. And that's a term that was coined, I think, in the 70s. And it's kind of where this whole industry started. And it was kind of, it's connected to faith-based investors. It's, we should be socially responsible. We should, be good citizens. And then, later, the common parlance evolved into talking about ESG investing. And that's much more specific. That's talking about environmental issues, social issues, and corporate governance. And so that ESG becomes slightly more specific. And then finally, impact investing, which is, you could even call it a category within ESG investing, specifically refers to, you start the conversation with what is the impact you're going to have, and then you talk about the investment. So it's kind of, it puts the social or environmental impact first. It's not an afterthought. The next bullet point, and this is another important one, some people confuse impact investing with philanthropy. And it happens to me, every day, not every day, but a few times a week, I'll speak to an investor and I'll say, yeah, I'm working with this impact fund. And they'll immediately slightly tune out because they'll think I'm talking about the willingness to give up return to create an impact. So, and there are investors who are like that. They're willing to take 2% instead of 5% if it does good. And what's happening today is there's a slight shift in what impact investing is, away from this concessionary investor attitude towards investors who they want to make a full market return and they want to have an impact. And in fact, it's the impact that often drives the return. It's solving for, it's creating electric cars and electric mobility that gives them the return. So it's kind of upside down today. The impact actually drives the return. It's not something you do instead of getting a return. So I think that's a really important distinction. When I talk about impact investing, it's not philanthropy. It's not giving money away. It's real investing with an expected return. Having said that, you sometimes can create a structure where you get like a development bank coming in, and this is called blended capital. They'll come in and they'll be willing to take a lower return or a first loss if there's a loss in the investment. And they're in the business to do that. They're not in the business to make money. They're in the business to facilitate a social goal. And so you could have a capital structure where you have a development bank with a concessionary return and a pension fund here with wanting a normal return. I'm working on a deal right now with green infrastructure in India, and the UN has a fund where they can invest and take a first loss, and it'll attract market-based investors into the project because the first $200 million is protected by this investor willing to take a loss. So that's an example of a blended capital structure. I'm going to risk losing myself here, and I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Any comments, questions, issues? Okay. I'll go back to sharing the right screen. And the last thing I want to say on this slide is that there's a current debate happening in the U.S. It's something that concerns me greatly, and it's in the news. It's in the news that I read pretty much every day. I don't know that it's on the news that everybody else reads that often, but the U.S. Department of Labor, which is headed by a UVA grad who was my roommate third year, the current Secretary of Labor, Gene Scalia, the current Department of Labor is considering making ESG issues forbidden for pension fund trustees to look at when they decide what funds should be in a pension fund or in a retirement fund. And the Department of Labor has jurisdiction over public retirement funds because it's connected to labor. And so their thinking, which is, in my opinion, very flawed thinking, is that retirement funds only care about the return and should not care about environmental or social issues. And what we've come to learn in the investment world is that actually solving environmental and social issues is what often creates the return. It's not a hindrance to the return. And so this has been, their new guidance has been out for public comment recently, and 95% of the public comments was against their guidance, very much against their guidance. And the 5% that supports their guidance were, DC lobbyists that work for the oil industry. So, it's these ESG and impact topics, are starting to bubble up everywhere, including, guidance on how our retirement funds get managed. So it's something that should concern us all. I think this is a good point, a good time to make the point. ESG investing and impact investing, which is obviously in the financial sector, has to work hand in glove with public policy. And that very much relates then to the Batten School of Public Policy. It's the financial sector can't solve social and environmental problems, but we can help. But we have to work alongside policymakers at every level, federal, state, city, etc. Okay, let me unshare. Any questions, comments on that? Okay. I will go go back to the presentation. Okay. So this is a bit, I'm going to go through a bit of history here. So the beginning of this kind of investing was really the faith-based world. And, you know, in Jewish law back in the 2nd century BC in the Talmud, there's, you know, language about you should do no harm. And, you know, people at that time believed that that also related to how they did business, what sort of, how they ran companies, how they spent their money, how they allocated their resources. And that's, you know, people who look back at the history of impact investing refer to this, you know, this phenomenon. And, you know, a few centuries later, in Muslim law, you have the do not exploit becomes a new directive. And that's where we get Sharia law and the fact that in certain Muslim communities, in Orthodox Muslim communities, you cannot charge interest. And that's a big issue when you go to the Middle East. And then, you know, fast forward to the 17th century, England, the US, the Quakers had very strict rules about how they could run businesses and how they could spend their money and how they could invest. And a big part of it was forbidding slavery. And to this, they established an investment company called Friends Fiduciary, which is in business today. And one of the best sources of research on especially racial justice and investing is the American Friends Service Committee. And it's a research unit that's run by the Quakers. It's based in Oakland, California, and they're really at the cutting edge of researching companies that you know, run private prisons, that do things that are you know, racist. And so so the Quaker, you know, the Quaker influence on impact investing is still very much alive today. Later, you had the Methodists in the 18th century, where they had sort of no sin stocks were allowed, or no investments, and that was really no alcohol, no tobacco, no weapons. And today that still exists. The Methodist Church has sort of a collective organization called Westpath. It's near Chicago. And they invest the money of all the different Methodist churches, all their endowments, all their pension fund money. I think it's about a $30 billion system. And they have a very big commitment to ESG investing, and especially environmental issues. And they're kind of a leader in the field. And, you know, they're very much of a return-based investor. But they're an example of, in this country, early stage impact investing that's still very much active today. And then, you know, as far as faith-based investors go, almost 50 years ago, here, I'm in New York, here in New York, the ICCR was established. It's the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. And they're an organization very dear to my heart. They are one of the leaders in shareholder activism. So what they do is it's really a bunch of, it's like Catholic and Episcopalian and Jewish pension funds and endowments, and they come together twice a year in person, and in between they do a lot of work, and they decide which public companies are they going to attack, so to speak. Are they going to show up at the annual meeting, come with a shareholder proposal, ask about you know, gender equity, ask about carbon emissions. You know, they've been really active with Exxon, you know, along with the Rockefeller family as a shareholder activist team. So they're quite a strong actor in the impact field as it relates to shareholder activism, which is one of the tools of impact investing and ESG investing. Let me see if I can get back. Any questions on that, by the way? Okay, I'll move on. The next bit of history, I have two more history slides, then we'll move on to Chris. The second part of the history of this sort of investing was in the more recent, like in the 60s, the anti-apartheid movement here in the US in the 60s, 70s, 80s, really, it called for a lot of college endowments, but really investors across the board to divest from South African companies. And suddenly all the big American and European investors wouldn't invest in any South African businesses. And it was part of what helped bring apartheid to its knees in South Africa. And that's often that's an early tangible result of impact investing or socially responsible investing in the US. Later, we had a number of big corporate disasters or corporate scandals. You had the Bhopal disaster, you had the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and that created a lot of interest in what we call CSR, corporate social responsibility. And basically, investors were going to public companies saying, you can't do this sort of thing. You have to be more accountable. You have to act like a social citizen. And actually, Chris, who's speaking next from USCIF, I believe the USCIF came out of this movement in the 80s, this call for corporate social responsibility. Later on and more recently, we have the topic of fossil fuel investment, and that's been a big push in the last, 20 years. It's almost becoming a moot point because most investors realize that fossil fuels are a stranded asset. Oil companies are starting to write down their oil portfolios to being worth zero. So, fossil fuel divestment is it's still happening, but most investors, for economic reasons, are getting rid of these stocks. Fossil fuel divestment is not only an environmental issue, it's also a social justice issue, because the pollution we get from carbon emissions tends to affect poor communities and communities of color much more than others. And so we also speak about climate justice. It's not just an environmental issue, but a social issue. And as we move out of a fossil fuel driven economy into a clean energy economy, we hope to see a just transition. We hope that everyone benefits from this across all sectors of society. And then the most recent movements that have become very, very hot have been gender equity in this country in the last 5 years, and very most recently racial equity. And investors and investment firms are still figuring out what that means. What does it look like to invest and care about gender equity? What does it look like to invest and care about racial equity? What does an anti-racist investor do with their money, and what don't they do? And these are topics we'll talk about later in the fall. And I believe, let me see. Yeah, okay. And recently, this goes back to the word ESG was coined by Kofi Annan at the UN, and he convened a group of 20 financial institutions in 2004. Together, they had assets of over $6 trillion. And they published a report that's in the Dropbox that you all have access to. And it's when you have a free 5 hours, by all means, go ahead and read it. But it's called "Who Cares Wins," and it's it's a foundational document to this sector, to ESG investing. And it's where, he and the group that he convened, said the 3 areas of interest are the environment, social issues, and governance. And that's where ESG was born. And they the report came out with a bunch of recommendations. A bunch of actors in the financial sector, big fund management firms, big pension funds, said that they would start to look at it and figure out what it meant and how do you do it? How do you do environmental investing? How do you do social investing, governance? And it's little by little been moving forward since, but that's really the beginning of ESG investing. And finally, the topic at hand, impact investing is the newest. The term was really coined 10 years ago. The Rockefeller Foundation every year convenes a bunch of foundations and they meet in Lake Como in North Italy, and it's kind of a fun time, but they also do a lot of business. And US foundations had started to realize that they could use the corpus, the money they have. I mean, they give money away, but they also have money that they invest. And they could make, not only should they promote social justice and environmental justice by giving out grants, but they should also use the money they have invested to do the same thing. And they started to call that impact investing. And they were typically concessionary investors. They were typically willing to take a lower return to have a beneficial social or environmental goal. But then they started to realize, wow, actually a lot of our impact investments are doing better than our normal investments. In fact, impact investing, impact is a good source of return. You know, again, like solving for, solving for fossil-free mobility, electric cars. I mean, look at the stock price of Tesla. I mean, I wish I'd bought it. You know, so being an impact investor and making impacts can actually make you a lot of money. And so now, little by little, impact investing is being rethought of. There are concessionary investors, but there are also market return-based investors in impact investing. And this report is also available in your Dropbox. It's worth reading. It's a lot shorter than the Who Cares Wins report, but it's, basically JP Morgan together with the Rockefeller Foundation published this report on, what is impact investing? It's this new thing. It's this new emerging asset class, they called it. And, as I highlighted, you can channel large scale private capital for social benefit. They kind of tried to end the idea of binary thinking, good versus bad. Most things are kind of both good and bad together. So, getting rid of that binary choice in investing. And little by little, impact investing, it's 10 years later, is starting to become mainstream. Most investment committees, that's not true, but many investment committees are starting to look at impact investing and how do they include that into their process. Okay. And with that, I will quickly mention the UN SDGs. As I said earlier, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are what I like best as a framework to think about ESG or impact investing. It's very logical. And I was lucky to realize that just a few weeks ago, Chris, as the research manager of USIF, came out with a new report on how are the SDGs being used by investors in different asset classes, in fixed income, in equities. And I will turn it over to Chris to talk about that.
Great, thank you.
I'll stop the share. Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try screen sharing. I've never done it before either, so give me a second. Is that working?
Yes.
Perfect.
Great. Well, hi everyone. My name is Chris Phelan. I am the research manager at USIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. We are essentially the trade association for the US sustainable investing community. We obviously have research, we have education and public policy advocacy. So Christian mentioned the Department of Labor. We could do a whole session just on that, but we won't bore you too much with that. A little bit, my background before coming to USIF was actually in corporate social responsibility and public policy in the natural resources sector. So I know both sides of things, and I've come to the side of light, is what I call it. And so today I'm going to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which Christian mentioned. They came out of a report that we were working on for about 9 months, which grew out of an interest, which I'll go into a bit more later in the presentation of, a lot of people are saying they care about the SDGs. So what are they doing and what is happening in the investor world to actually address the issues raised by the SDGs, since they are such kind of a nice condensation of so many ESG or sustainability issues. So First of all, I just have to say that nothing in this report is investment advice, marketing, or an endorsement. So don't necessarily or don't at all invest based on this report. Yeah, so the US SIF and the US SIF Foundation have about 300 members who represent more than $3 trillion in assets under management across asset classes and sustainable investment actors, community development financial institutions, financial planners, advisors. Christian went over what some of the different asset classes are. We represent people who offer and invest in all of those kinds of products. Here's a bit more about what we offer. So our research kind of undergirds the whole organization. We put out a report every 2 years that is the definitive snapshot of the assets in the industry, what people care about, what has changed, what the big trends are since the previous report was released 2 years prior. And we are coming out with that, the next iteration of that in November. We offer education and training, and for anyone on the course on the call who's interested, we actually have a 30-minute free course for individual investors. If you guys want to learn any more in your free time, we do public policy. We have well, when we could travel, we did a lot of conferences and convenings. So that's just a quick overview of US SIF, and I wanted to kind of jump into, I think, the most important issue that I understand that the Batten School is focusing on through this, and that's social justice. USIF is deeply committed to that. As you saw, we were founded in the early 80s as part of the response to apartheid and various environmental and labor disasters. So recently, we contributed to and signed the investor statement of solidarity to address systemic racism and call to action. And we're developing a racial justice toolkit, and that'll have an explanation of investment options in how an anti-racist can invest. So there'll be some hopefully answers to the question that you posed, Christian, and also opportunities to take action in your community and with your investments and money. So hopefully you guys can keep those in mind as you progress in your careers and graduate. So a quick summary of US SIF's stance and policies on some of these. We use the term ESG fairly broadly to encapsulate sustainable impact investing. And I just wanted to share this little wheel with you so that you can see in more detail what E, S, and G actually mean. So if someone says, I'm an environmental investor, what does that mean? They might care about sustainable natural resources or clean technology, social in particular, labor relations, human rights, social, I'll talk about it a bit later, has typically been the most difficult for people to get their investing mind around. And I think the SDGs help people understand how they can invest for a more just society. And as you'll see later on, the SDGs and this kind of ESG wheel and ESG criteria are basically entirely intertwined. They overlap in a really almost seamless way, but the SDGs have kind of put them into more digestible boxes in a framework that I think works really well, particularly for new entrants into the field or folks who might be a little more dubious about sustainable investing, which unfortunately there are a few of those out there. And so here is some of the approaches that we lay out and kind of define in terms of ESG incorporation. And, you know, basically these are all to say that and define how ESG data and information gets incorporated into investment decisions across all of the asset classes that are available. And an investor can choose kind of any way that they want to do it. They can only invest in what they view as the best products or stocks. They can be negative or exclusionary, like the Quakers and the Methodists, and get out of weapons and prisons and things like that. ESG integration, which is sort of the the newest form, and some people have a problem with it. It's basically just saying like we consider ESG factors throughout our investment process, and some people feel like that's a bit too vague. So that's something that we're working on here at USCIF to make that a bit clearer. And again, the SDGs provide very specific 17 goals that you can point to as a client or an investor and say, here is what I am integrating specifically, 5, 6, 10, whatever the choices may be. And so the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goals. They were adopted in 2015 by all of the UN member states. It's like 198 countries agreed on all of these. So that's no small feat. And I was actually in New York for the launch of the SDGs. It was pretty exciting. It was heady days, I guess, as they say. And so the goals seek to address a number of interrelated issues. Kind of the overriding one is SDG number 1, which is global poverty, but also inequality, climate change, infrastructure, healthy cities, environmental degradation, kind of writ large, which is like life on land, life on sea, clean technology, and then peace and justice being the end goal of all of that. And just for your reference, these replace the Millennium Development Goals, which ran from 2000 to 2015. There were 8 of them. They're often thought to have not been super effective in reaching their goals, but one place where they were very effective was in combating the HIV/AIDS epidemic and malaria and tuberculosis. They made significant headway on that, particularly in Southeast Asia and Africa. And in the report that we released, you can see some of the statistics. It's in the millions of lives saved through that. And so the SDGs, like the Millennium Development Goals, are designed to last for 15 years. So we're 5 years in, and it's a good time to reflect. And they're unique from the Millennium Development Goals in that the Millennium Goals were really just about countries and public policy to change things. But the SDGs are very specific that investors, business, private capital need to have an equal seat at the table to help governments achieve the policy changes that they need, but also to funnel and allocate capital, particularly in emerging countries, to the kinds of projects and initiatives that need to be created to achieve the SDGs. And the UN estimates that there's annually a $2.5 trillion financing gap in developing countries alone needed to achieve the SDGs. So every year over 15 years, $2.5 trillion is missing. Only the private sector can help fill that. Unfortunately, the UN has recently put out warnings, and there's been some other studies that have come out that we're not on track to meet the SDGs right now. And one research firm recently put out a piece that said, as things stand right now, we won't achieve them until 2086. So, Christian?
Could you go back one slide and show the SDG chart again? And let's just read through them, because I love this chart, and I like the colors and I'm just going to read through them for a second, if that's okay.
Of course.
So SDG 1 is no poverty. 2 is zero hunger. 3 is good health and well-being. 4 is quality education. So in October, we'll hear from someone whose focus is SDG 4, quality education. 5 is gender equality. 6 is clean water and sanitation. 7 is affordable and clean energy. And I like that. It's affordable and clean energy. That's a reference to the just transition. It's solar power can't just be available for the rich, and electric cars. It's affordable. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. Number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Number 10, reduced inequalities. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. Number 12, responsible consumption and production. That's a good one. It's like getting rid of plastic containers is a big part of that. Number 13, climate action. Number 14, life below water. Number 15, life on land. Number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And number 17, partnerships for the goals. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to that and go through.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's important to go through all of them, and I'll touch on some, or I'll explain some examples of investing in these and the case for them a bit further down. So, but it's good to know what they all are, and that I think that we'd all like to see them achieved. Okay, so yes, social justice and the SDGs. So, like I said before, the S in ESG is gaining a lot more focus, particularly during the pandemic and after the murder of George Floyd. Other S issues include health and wellness, gender equality, and the SDGs can help as a framework for businesses and investors to think about how to reallocate their capital towards these sorts of issues. And just to be super clear, the SDGs are designed to make a more equitable society for everyone. And it's important to remember, and thank you, Christian, I think it's really useful that you just went over all of this. All 17 of the goals don't exist in a vacuum. They are designed to be intersectional, and they can only be solved effectively together. For instance, racial and environmental injustice often go hand in hand. You see that in inner cities in America, on Native American reservations, around natural resource production in emerging countries. And another example is gender discrimination and violence and educational attainment. If women are being discriminated against, or having violence perpetrated against them en masse, they are not going to be able to get the sort of education that will allow society to actually progress in a sustainable manner. And it's just obviously wrong on its face to do any of that. So here's just an example that I was able to find of kind of the intersectionality of how it all feeds up and how it is all interrelated. I just thought this was an interesting visual of one entity's interpretation of how it works. The environment supports society, which supports the economy, which leads to peace, justice, and goodwill among men. I can't read what the third one is, but yeah, so I thought that was interesting. And Christian, I think to some of the points that you made, having the economy at the top, achieving these just societies and healthy biospheres leads to a more productive economy, which is a good end goal. But having a just society and a healthy environment are also very good goals in their own right. And so for our membership and the investment community, kind of writ large, they're going to ask, okay, we want to do this. How are we going to have, what's the impact we're going to have? And is there a real world business case for returns? So just two examples: gender equality, like I was saying, improving access to education and reducing violence against women, increasing property rights and financial rights. In a lot of countries, you need a man to co-sign a mortgage, or to get a loan, or basically to do any kind of things that we take for granted. And removing these barriers will allow women and girls to add their productive capacity to society, which makes us all better off. And then to the second question, an investor might ask, there's been a huge amount of studies that have come out about the financial returns from investing in gender equality. But one of our members, Pax World Funds, found that the top quartile of companies that had the best gender diversity in their leadership were also the top performing stocks in the MSCI World Index, which tracks a huge number of equities. And these companies on average delivered 1.3% higher returns, which is pretty significant if you're an investor. And then the second one is SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. I like that you pointed out affordable, Christian, because coming from the natural resources sector, one of the arguments against clean energy is often that, well, you're going to shut out 2 billion people from having access to any electricity if you get rid of coal. So making sure that the transition is just is the right thing to do. But as you'll see with this data, it's actually right now and definitely in the future, the more profitable thing to do. So currently, not even currently, as of 2019, more than 1/3 of global power capacity was based on renewable energy. And this includes biomass power, hydropower, geothermal, and onshore wind. And the pricing is competitive compared to fossil fuels. And that's just last year, before we've seen a lot of these natural disasters that are caused by climate change. So this is an investment opportunity that is incredibly important and potentially in the trillions of dollars if you read some of the research on it. And it's not going away. People want it. People demand it. It's basically the way of the future. And so that's just 2 of the 17, the impact that you can have and the financial returns that would come with it, which is again usually the 2 most important questions that an investor would ask when being asked about or responding to a question of what do you do around the SDGs, or why should I do it? And so kind of more generally in the fixed income space, which is the most common asset in fixed income is bonds issued by companies, and sometimes governments. We've seen a very significant rise in green bonds, which are basically debt issued by a corporation or a government, where the proceeds from that debt go towards a renewable energy plant, basically anything that they would consider quote unquote green. And we'll get into why I said quote unquote there. And also in the fixed income space, there's been the emergence of social sustainability, SDG, and transition bonds, which are quite interesting and even more vague than green bonds. But I think they will be very important going forward for the financial industry. And that is because of what we call greenwashing or SDG washing, which is the greatest risk to not necessarily your financial performance, but to the impact that you want to have. And these 2 terms refer to a corporation or a financial advisor or money manager who says a product does something and is being disingenuous about the actual impact that it will have. So it's false marketing, and it's something that the industry is really has been worried about for quite some time. And I think that the SDGs, to reiterate the point, are a framework through which you can really drill down into a corporation or a financial planner and ask them, okay, you say you do this. What are the metrics based on SDG 7 that you're going to achieve to provide clean and affordable energy? How are you actually doing that? And just one example that I think is really interesting food for thought for you guys coming out of this is the transition bond, which are increasingly offered by like gigantic multinational agricultural interests or large oil producers, which is debt issued that's designed to finance their less sustainable operations to ostensibly transition to more sustainable business practices. And I would pose it to you guys as the emerging leaders is, can transition bonds or lending at all to high carbon intensive companies or companies that destroy rainforests, can it actually be considered a step forward? Is the perfect the enemy of the good, or is there wiggle room there to help companies get better. And I think it's somewhat of a subjective question, but the SDGs are there to kind of help guide through that question as you think about it and graduate and have your own investments and make your way into the job market. And the other main asset class that we focused on in this report was equities, which is stocks. SDG funds are, there are more of them, but the equity space focused on SDGs is not as mature as the fixed income space, particularly green bonds. And I don't know how many of you are investing in mutual funds or exchange traded funds quite yet, but when you are, and if you are trying to put your money towards the SDGs, it's really important that you read the prospectus of the fund for which SDGs they focus on, what sort of analysis they use, and what are the metrics, their impact reporting metrics. And along with that, asking and reading about the firm's shareholder engagement strategy is also really important, because that can have a huge effect, and that's actually under attack in the public policy space as well. But again, we're not there right now. And just to prove the effectiveness of shareholder engagement to you, this is not related to the SDGs per se, but I thought that you guys would find it interesting. A number of our members, along with Native American tribes from across the country, were actually responsible for the Redskins changing their name ultimately to the Washington football team right now. They, for years, brought shareholder proposals to the annual meetings of Nike, the biggest sponsor of the Washington football team, and FedEx, whose name is on the football team's stadium. And ultimately, the pressure built up. And then earlier this year, Nike and FedEx said, Dan Snyder, you gotta change it now. This is bad press. We're losing money. We're losing customers. And so it worked. And there is maybe not the most important social justice win that we're currently hoping for, but it really affected real world change by going to these companies and letting them know what their priorities were as shareholders, and it worked. And then private equity, which Christian and Professor Mahoney talked about briefly, is really still in the formative stages of addressing the ESGs. There's not a whole lot of there quite yet, but there's some guidelines out for private equity managers who might be interested in that. So if any of you guys are thinking of starting a private equity firm when you leave UVA, I have some good guides for you. And so the last part in the meat of our report was interviewing investors and seeing, okay, what are they actually doing outside of this data and these charts. Like I mentioned, in our 2018 biannual snapshot of the industry, we asked, as part of questions on the motivation to pursue sustainable investing or ESG investing, do you invest to achieve the SDGs? And this was the first time that we asked it. 56 money managers representing $2.15 trillion said that they invested to achieve the SDGs. And institutional asset owners representing $4 billion said that they invested to help fulfill one or more of the SDGs. So what exactly does that mean in practical terms? It's, especially for money managers, a huge amount of money. Basically, what we found is that investors, and particularly sustainable investors, have been focusing on the issues that the SDGs have consolidated for years, if not decades. I think you've seen that in the history that Christian laid out. People have cared about these 17 things for a very long time. And so those investors are just able to kind of easily say, well, our gender fund is SDG 5. Done. There's an SDG 5 fund for you. But for kind of traditional money managers and investors, they're doing something that's called mapping their investments, which is a sort of a confusing term, but they are doing what I just described sustainable investors were undergoing and trying to rejigger and remarket some of their funds to basically be mapped, if you will, to touch on SDGs through their analysis and metrics. And, like I say here, this can be a vague practice and one that we wanted to point out in this report that, mapping can be a way to hide greenwashing. It's great that people are thinking about the SDGs and how their investments might relate, but they might not always be being genuine. And so that's why, like previously, we would recommend that you really dig into a fund's information if and when you're thinking about investing in the SDGs. And we also found something that I think is really important and ties into a lot of what we said. Macroeconomic growth and stability from fulfilling the SDGs would create a more sustainable economy for long-term broad value creation. That is, women and girls doing better leads to better value creation and equity across the world. Affordable energy helps lift up everyone and creates more productive markets. Having sustainable oceans creates more sustainable and profitable and productive supply chains. You could go across all 17 and see how achieving them not only achieves the goal and the impact, but also improves the world economy and makes everyone better off economically. And I think the most interesting and effective way to measure that is through the targets and indicators, which are parts of the goals. There are many of them. So each goal will have certain targets and indicators under them. Across all 17, there are 169 targets. And then under the targets, there are 232 indicators. These provide a much more granular level of analysis, which make them much easier for stakeholders and shareholders and investors to understand. For instance, should have taken a screenshot of this, but on SDG 7, the affordable and clean energy, they call for a specific amount of gigawatts to be created by a certain time frame. And they have these kind of really quantitative action items under all of these. So if you're looking to understand it a bit more and you feel like, just life on land maybe doesn't explain it all for you quite enough about what that means or what, infrastructure and efficient cities means, there's really, really useful information under this that underscores what Christian has said about it being just an extremely useful framework to start thinking about social progress, social justice, environmental progress through investing. And so I just wanted to leave you guys with a few questions not to be answered, but based on what Christian and I and what you've read, do the SDGs seem achievable to you guys? Is there anything, that you feel US SIF or the industry is missing about how investors can contribute to the achievement of the SDGs? And just for yourselves over the years, do you have plans post-graduation to work in any of the fields or issues addressed by the SDGs? I was really encouraged to hear Ted's introduction about how interested you all are in leadership and social justice and kind of changing the world. I feel the same way and respect that a lot. So, I hope you guys will consider that. I'd be happy to, connect with any of you guys individually after this. We actually just hired a UVA graduate to a public policy position. She just graduated last year. So we are big fans of yours. And, we think that the work is really important and your guys' passion is awesome. So thank you guys so much. I happy to answer any questions or, chat after this.
Thank you so much, Chris.
A lot, Chris. Chris, I had a question for anybody on the call who wants to dig down deeper into the 17 SDGs and look at the underlying factors. Where would they find that information?
Yes, I have here.
Let's maybe drop the screen share so we can come back together.
Yeah, how do I do that?
Good question.
There you go.
Did I do it? Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
There, everyone's back. Hi.
Yes, you can actually find that. Let me get the exact, I will send out the URL in the chat here in just 1 second.
So that was a lot of information this last hour, and I'm wondering for anybody here, what are your thoughts? What do you believe, disbelieve? Which SDG is your favorite? What are the social or environmental problems you're most concerned about? If anybody wants to throw something out there, we're happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was just curious. I think it was in talks that like ESG and businesses being green would be incorporated into like the bond rating system. Has that happened yet? And if not, just like for a traditional bond, like are green initiatives incorporated into that rating?
That's a good question. Kind of. Chris, I'll let you go first.
I can half answer that question. So there's a new industry which is the new green bond designation is not yet a legal designation. People can call themselves a green bond, and I think it's one of the biggest areas for potential greenwashing, for people to fake. Hi, I'm raising a green bond. I'm going to invest the money in, recycling the plastics that we create. And meanwhile, they all go to the landfill, and no one checks up afterwards. So I've met a woman who's a green bond verifier, and she actually goes after these green bond issuers and checks up afterwards and writes a report. But it's still a cottage industry. And I don't believe that any of the big bond rating firms have incorporated it into their system, but I'm not totally sure about that. It's still pretty early days. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. The Climate Bonds Initiative is the one where I got the data for the report on green bond issuances, and they're kind of the gold standard right now, but there is no legally defined rating body for fixed income products issued that are green. We would love to see that, though. It's a tough question.
Could you see it happening in the near future?
In the US, you need to define near future. In the EU, maybe.
Definitely the EU before the US. Yes. I mean, the EU is just, they're on it, much more. And, the US, we have too many lobbyists in Washington. You don't have that in Europe who try to block initiatives that threaten their, the oil industry. I will give you an anecdote. I was at a conference. One of the last conferences I attended before the world lockdown was in New York in December. And it's sort of the big annual sustainable investing conference, and people come from, all over the world, really. It was a big, 300-person event. And I'll name them because why not? But Wellington was launching a new green bond fund, and the green bond fund manager was presenting to us in like a private session off to the side. And the room had, I was sitting with 3 of the biggest state pension fund managers in the country. And the city of San Francisco, the head of their pension fund, was sitting with me. And it was a pretty important room with a lot of money. And, they were doing their presentation. And one of the people I was sitting with, I think it was the guy that runs the San Francisco Public Retirement Fund, said, well, once you invest in the green bonds, do you, after the fact, go verify that they've done what they said they do with the money? And the manager laughed. Oh, of course not. We don't bother with that. And, I tuned out after I heard that. And I think half the room kind of tuned out. And, you still have a lot of, consumers are starting to want green bond portfolios and ESG portfolios and impact investment portfolios. So every firm is, throwing the label onto their products and kind of coming out with a half-baked product. There are also some for real actors, no question, but you have to be careful for the greenwashing. And I think it's most evident in the bond market. So,
Yeah.
Good question. I think you should start that business. Anybody else with a question? Or, I mean, what about companies that what about products you use? When you go buy, go shopping, or when do you decide where you shop? Do you shop at Target? Do you shop at Walmart? Do you think about the implications of those companies when you spend your money there? And when you purchase items, do you think about the supply chain? Do you think about how green the product's manufacturing was? It's, that's usually the start for most individuals, thinking about how you consume.
I was wondering, to what extent is it possible for us to actually filter with regards to like what we consume? Because I feel like it's just such a long supply chain. It's international, as shown by COVID. It's been very easy to disrupt. It's like, I mean, from what I've heard, it's you have to pick your battles. It's like, am I going to focus on the environment? Am I going to focus on not making sure child labor is not a component in creating these products? So how would, in your opinion, be the best way to go about choosing a product and sticking to like an ideal?
That's a great question. I think the simple answer is you're never going to find a company or product that's nothing's 0 and nothing's 100. Everything's somewhere in the middle. And so and picking your battles is a good way to phrase it. I'm going to use Walmart as an example. As a New York City resident, we don't have Walmarts, but I spend my summers in Maine, and it's very exciting because when I go to Maine, I get to shop at a Walmart. There's one near where I go. And the first client that I had that had a very strict restricted list against companies was the big Norwegian pension fund. It's almost $1 trillion in assets. They're one of the biggest investors in the world. And 15 years ago, the Norwegian pension fund, and everybody was watching them because they're such a big pool of assets. They came out when they first launched their first list of companies they won't invest in for ethical or environmental reasons. The first company that they blocked was Walmart. And it's the Walmart, CEO is absolutely shocked. And other investors started to copy the Norwegian pension fund's list. Like, oh, they let them do the research. We'll just also boycott the same companies. And Walmart had a big problem. And the problem they had with Walmart wasn't so much environmental, it was much more social. Because Walmart is infamous for hiring only part-time staff, so they don't have to offer health insurance and other benefits that you have to offer with full-time staff. And they were exploitative employers. And they didn't have a great environmental footprint. They would source their goods from the cheapest supplier. So maybe it was made in a sweatshop in Bangladesh, and they didn't really care. But what the Norwegian pension fund does is they boycott, but they'll engage with you. So they actually twice a year they would sit down with Walmart's key staff, say, the reason we boycotted you is these 10 reasons, and show us evidence that you're getting better, and we will we'll invest in you. And so every year they met, and about 3 years ago, they put Walmart back into their portfolio. And, it was a big announcement. And so I think the threat of divesting from a company, coupled with engaging with the company, the two together, is what you need to do. Divesting alone, I don't think is really works, because they'll find other investors. But if you threaten to divest and you engage and you help the company along, that's very effective.
Thanks for that response.
Did that answer your question, or was that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would just say really quickly to answer that at kind of a more personal level, like the industry itself, we didn't start off as trying to tackle everything all at once. I mean, I think, especially if you don't have a portfolio or something and you're just focusing on the products that you buy, figure out 2 or 3 things that are really important to you, and, figure out what brands that you don't want to buy, which ones do have the kind of practices that you do want to buy, and just kind of keep your North Star of wanting to do good at a broader scale in mind, and just move towards that. But you don't have to, you don't have to bite off more than you can chew right now. And if everyone just does that, I think that, that's the kind of large scale improvements that we'd want to see. And so I would just recommend doing that, because it sounds like you've got the right idea already.
And we have a question from the chat, which asks, what are some helpful sites to find out about and verify if companies are meeting kind of their standards and goals? Kind of building off of what Chris mentioned, I'll mention one. There's something called Slavery Footprint, where you can scan the barcode of a product and see if there's using modern day slaves in their production, which you see, in places like in the lake region of northern Ghana, things like fisheries in Southeast Asia. So there still is modern day slavery going on. And that's one where, if that's something you're kind of committed to, making sure it's not in your supply chain, there's a resource there. Other sites to find out about what companies are really doing good work, Christian and Chris?
Yeah, one of them, and it's for a financial product itself, but the Climate Bonds Initiative, they have like reviews and ratings by independent organizations available for a lot of the bonds that they have certified. So you can read like basically like a Moody's will go in and audit the bond and make sure that the money is going where they said, that the impacts are happening. Unfortunately, one of the findings from our report was that there really isn't like a compendium or someone like the UN cataloging all of these investments and company practices into like one place where you can find it all. But yes, things like Slavery Footprint, the Climate Bonds Initiative. I have an app on my phone called Buycott, Buycott, similar to Slavery Footprint. You can scan a barcode or whatever they call those things, and it'll come up basically what the supply chain is, who owns all of the various permutations of the company that created it, and that can help you in terms of kind of product and company specific. But one thing that we'd love to see, particularly in a legal framework, is some sort of verification and disclosure scheme across all of the ESG criteria. And Bo, to your question, that's probably not going to happen in the US anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, what I'll add to that is that I'll answer the question from 2 different angles. From the angle of a portfolio manager putting together let's say a mutual fund, there are a few tools that they have at their disposal that look at corporations, public companies, and all the big rating agencies. Like Bo asked about bonds, but where there are ratings are with stocks, and so like MSCI and Standard & Poor's and some of these big rating agencies do have, you can buy the ratings of every company in the S&P 500, and they'll rate them by E, S, and G. And I think it might even get more granular than just environmental, social, or governance. And you could look at Microsoft, or look at Walmart, or look at whatever company that's in the S&P 500, and see how they're rated by MSCI and Standard & Poor's. My experience with that is that those rating agencies, it's kind of a quick glance. It's not really a deep dive. And one example of that is that for gender equity, if you have one woman on the board, you qualify as being gender equal or gender okay. And I want to see 50% of the board women, not one person. So it's there are issues like that I think that they're a little bit too simplistic, but it would be great to move in that direction, I think. And then I think on a topic by topic basis, I personally looked at the S&P 500, and I looked at which companies had 0 women on the board, and there were 5. And 4 of them were companies I kind of guessed, like the oil pipeline company that went through Standing Rock, Energy Transfer Partners, they have no women on the board. That didn't surprise me. But the one company that did surprise me that I until then did business with and no longer do is TripAdvisor. I used to go on their website to look at hotel ratings and TripAdvisor at the time had no women on the board. So I told all my friends and posted it to Facebook and boycotted TripAdvisor. But, it takes a lot of footwork. Sadly, there is no one place to go.
Yeah, and I just sent through 2 others, which are a bit more in the weeds, but one of them is called Sustainalytics, and they were just bought by Morningstar. They provide the same kind of data as like MSCI or Moody's, S&P, but honestly, often a bit more granular and a bit better in my opinion. And the second one is As You Sow, which is another member firm. And the site that I sent you, you can go and actually type in any fund name or ticker or money manager. I'm like on the gender equality fund rating system right now. So you can type in any fund manager or stock ticker, and it will bring up a rating of how well that fund is doing regarding gender equality or gender diversity. And it'll give you specific metrics. It'll give you the fund's holdings, what companies it invests in, so you can understand kind of throughout the financial value chain, if you will, what things matter, why they're rated as such, and you can get an idea of what they can do better.
Awesome. Well, I think it would be very great to thank Chris for joining us tonight and sharing his expertise. So we'll give like a round of virtual clapping. I think as both Chris and Christian talked about, I hope one of the things that we can take away today is, even for example, on a case of gender lens investing, right? We can advocate that companies hire women at equal rates and pay them equal rates. We can advocate that they have policies. But when you have the carrot of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment steering clear of companies because they're not thinking about the role of women on their boards or in their C-suites, their leadership roles and their ranks. And this is just one example of the many different social issues that we want to see change over time, right? And so I think that they've made the point that this is a really powerful lever if we want to see the kind of the shape of our society change over time. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Christian. The next time we gather together, we'll have a little bit more workshop-y and you'll actually get your hands a little bit dirty thinking about how you might invest some money. So get ready for that. And thank you everybody for a really engaged conversation tonight. It was so
Thanks everybody. Sorry for my disability, but I'll try to do better next time.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I put my email in the chat, and hopefully Professor Mahoney, you can send it out if anyone's interested. And I just want to say, I see Jack Clark has an Arizona flag in the background. I'm from Arizona, so I recommend Jack for an A.
Nice.